Is the mic on? Oh, well, there it is. Okay. Good to see everybody. Appreciate you being here. Appreciate the opportunity. I was reared in the Midwest. I'm originally from Missouri, close to Kansas City. And so I know a little bit about the kind of area, but Texas, I've only been down here maybe 3, 4, 5 times. I can't quite remember. A couple of things about Texas that I suppose I'm familiar with. I bought these chips one time, Texas Heat barbecue chips, and I guess that familiarized me a little bit with the kind of territory and atmosphere down here. Interesting. Then we drove. It was 18 hours for us to drive. I told Hannah in the car, I thought, we just changed the oil the day before coming down here in this 2015 Chevrolet Tahoe. And I thought, we might have to get an oil change while we're down here before we head back, About 8,000 miles, it felt like anyway. And then the third thing, I heard about this rancher one time, and he was down on his property in Texas, and fella pulls in, and the dust is kicking up behind this black with the chrome rims, kind of Escalade kind of car, SUV, and he's pulling into this ranch. And he gets out of the car, and he's wearing a nice suit, and he's got a badge kind of like I'm wearing today, and he buttons up the suit, sticks the badge out on the front, and he tells the rancher in Texas, he says, "I'm here to inspect your property," and the rancher says to him, "You can go wherever you like, you can see any of the property. The only thing I would say is you don't go beyond this fence." Well, he says, "Look here, I've got this badge, and this badge tells you, and it tells me that I can go anywhere I want." And so he climbs over this fence and starts taking off, and the rancher stands there and just looks, and after a few minutes, here comes this dude, professional fella, booking it, wearing his suit, and he is just booking it. And all of a sudden, he's saying, "The bull, the bull." And the rancher says, "Show him your badge." Anyway, thanks for having us. Good to be in Texas with you all today. Appreciate the opportunity. We're in 1 Peter. We'll be hanging around 1 Peter chapter 1, 13 through 16. I'll tell you I move quickly. I don't know. I'd like to apologize for it. I don't know that I can. It's in my DNA. It's how I'm wired. And there's really no cure for me. So it is what it is. Thanks for being here. We're in 1 Peter. What we'll look at today is, of course, 1 Peter chapter 1, 13 through 16. We'll observe the context of the book, some of the major themes which have already been iterated to some extent, and then the points from our particular text that we're looking at. We'll notice 4 things. The situation, which is the context of the book. Number 2, we'll notice the preparation, or the plan. Number 3, we'll notice the transformation that we ought to undergo. And then number 4, we'll notice the sanctification, or the result. Number 1, then, the situation of the book. I'm one of those who thinks that this book is written just prior to the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. And I think that a lot of the temporal notions in the text are explained because of that context. So when the brother this morning told us about the diaspora, 1 Peter chapter 1, 1 and 2. These are Jews outside of the region of Palestine who are scattered. And I think that the rest of the text becomes explicable in that light. When it talks about them in a number of different ways, the fiery trial, 1 Peter chapter 1, 1 Peter chapter 4. When it talks about the judgment that's to begin at the household of God, and then it's a scarce salvation for them. I don't think he's talking about the second coming kind of thing there. 2 Peter chapter 1, 10 through 12 says that we would have an abundant entrance into the kingdom of God. So I think something different's there in view. And then in chapter 4, at least verse 7, when he talks about the end of all things, I think he's probably got the Jewish civil state in view. I think that the context of the book is Jewish. Now, I know that what the big hitters say is that this book is actually, if you pull out a popular commentary, one of them is going to say that this is written to Gentile Christians in a generalized way, and maybe the persecution is Rome. I'm not quite sure that that view has been proven, and that we can walk away from this text believing that. You give it a second look and see if that's not right. So I'm wanting us to be a little bit suspect about that. Number 2, then, I would point out to you that the context is probably the Jewish war ending in AD 70. And I think a load of things in the book becomes explicable because of that. Now we'll notice, and I differ from the brother this morning, either I or he miscounted. It's probably me. I have a struggle with that sort of thing. But it's either 16 or 17 times that the word suffering occurs in the book. And he's the Logos guy, so he's probably got it right. So suffering's a major theme, and he pointed that out to us this morning. Suffering is a major theme. Suffering is a major theme. We're going to see here in a moment what exactly suffering is. But let me tell you something I read a moment ago. Don't quote me on the fellow, but I think if I'm remembering correctly, it was Stanley Hauerwas that said that the Christian doesn't have an adequate answer to suffering. Can you stomach that? Folks, for whatever this is worth, if the Christian doesn't have an adequate answer on suffering, I'll tell you this, nobody does. Am I right? If the Christian doesn't have an adequate answer to the evil, pain, and suffering of the world, then just this is how it sits, then nobody does. And I'd like us to reorient in our view of what suffering is and what its purpose is. So we looked at a number of these texts already, and because of that, I won't call your attention to them again, but we should just note that suffering is a major emphasis. He says that we ought to suffer as a Christian, but do look at this one once more with me. This is 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21. With Isaiah 53 at his back, 1 Peter chapter 2, 21 through 25, he says in chapter 2, verses 21 and following, but 21 especially, 2:21 of 1 Peter, "You've been called for this purpose, since Christ also, as the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, more there to unpack, but that's going to suffice for now, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps," and ... he goes on and says a bit more about Isaiah 53 and how it pertains to us. The only point I'm drawing out at this moment is that the suffering Savior, the suffering servant, our Messiah Jesus, somehow regarded our suffering as linked up with his. And I'm thinking at this point of Colossians 1:24, where Paul said of his sufferings that he filled up that which was lacking in the Messiah's sufferings. I'm thinking of Philippians chapter 3, 10 and 11, where he talks about, if I at first suffer, then I should attain to the resurrection of the dead. Philippians 3, 10 and 11. And then I'm thinking of some other passages, Matthew 25. Didn't he say something about this in Matthew 25 where he said, "As you've done it unto one of these, you've done it unto me"? Didn't he say in Acts chapter 9 to Paul, Saul of Tarsus on the way, didn't he say something like, "You've done it unto me"? You've been persecuting me. Why do you persecute me? That's what he said. I'm thinking about suffering, and what I'd like us to do for just a moment before I go on to our next point is try to reorient the purpose and the nature and the reason of suffering. You see, I heard a preacher not too long ago, member of the church, say something like, "When we suffer, it's not God's will." Folks, I know what I'm about to say is dangerous speech, but listen and listen closely. You won't get that out of Job 42. You will not get out of Job 42 that it's not God's will for us to suffer. In fact, in Job 42 at 11, this is the narrator at this point. I've heard the disputes about in Job 1. Well, Job said, you know what, the Lord has taken away, and Job was mistaken. Well, at this point in Job 42:11, it's not Job who's talking. This is the narrator. The inspired narrator of Job 42:11 says this. He says, "which the Lord did." I'm thinking of Philippians chapter 1 and verse 29 at this point, where he says in Philippians 1:29, "It was gifted unto you," or graced unto you, "to suffer for his name's sake." And then I'm thinking of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 and verse 7, where he says, I know what he says, that it's a messenger of Satan. Doesn't he say that? The thorn in the flesh? It's a messenger of Satan. That's what the text says. But it goes on to say that it was given to him, gifted to him. Who gave this thorn in the flesh to Paul? I don't think that we need to see a hard dichotomy between God's doing something and Satan's doing something. Haven't we read Genesis 50 and verse 20 where it says, "You meant it for evil, but it happened out for good"? Haven't we read of Romans 8:28? These things are happening, and God's got this big picture in view. You see, let me go on an ethical thing for just a moment here. 9/11. You guys know what happened on 9/11, right? Yeah, everybody does. Okay. Well, here's the thing. On 9/11, there was this fourth plane, and as we understand it, it was about to slam into the White House. Well, I'm told that they scrambled some jets, and they were going to have these jets following after this plane that was going to slam into the White House, one of 4 planes that day. And the ethical situation comes up. Do we shoot down the plane, innocent lives on board, or do we let it fly and innocent lives be taken anyway? And that's an ethical dilemma that is really difficult, isn't it? I don't know what your view is, but I raised this ethical dilemma a couple of weeks ago at Cherokee where I preach. And would you believe that we had half the audience saying one thing and half the audience saying the other? How to handle this ethical dilemma? Well, I'm not sure what the right answer is, and maybe you're not either, but let me go ahead and say this. In that kind of ethical dilemma and heightened circumstance, who better to make the call than Almighty God? You see, He's an omniscient being. He knows how to take all of the variables and work it all out to the best scenario. He knows how to work out the best scenario. And I'm thinking this, if we commit to our holy, loving, ethical Father, then whatever ethical dilemmas come about in our lives, I'm committed to this, and I think you should commit to this as well. He's committed to loving us and doing what is best for the sake of humanity. You see, if God had asked Paul would give you one of two things. Do you want luxury, no thorn in the flesh, and no salvation because of it to any other people? Or, Paul, I'll give you the thorn in the flesh, but because of your thorn, somehow, oh, maybe 500 plus will become saved. I think if you and I were Paul, and I think if we were standing there listening to Paul, he would have said this, give me the thorn. You see, Paul's not interested any longer, and this is the point that Peter's making to us as well, in just his own luxury. And the sad thing is, in God's will, I'm saying there's a difference between God's ultimate will and God's ideal will. Ideally, I think the text says that God would not have any suffer, but that all should come to the knowledge of the truth. Don't you read that? 2 Peter 3:9, that's what I read. But ultimately, didn't God create earth and all of us on it and know that there would be people that are not going to be saved? You see, ideally, his will is not always carried out, but his ultimate will always is. And I think Ephesians 1:10 and 11 has something to say about that. Now, how does this matter for us in Peter? Well, I'm arguing that this theme of suffering is broader than just Peter's text, but it's certainly a major one in Peter's text. And I think that God, even in our suffering, is committed to us, and He's committed to doing the best for humanity, and that we've got to reorient our view of suffering. So why would God, if He is a loving, holy Father, why would He allow all of this to happen? Well, there are various reasons, and I think sometimes we undercut them. You see, sometimes they're educational. In Psalm 119 and verse 71, the psalmist wrote, "It was good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes." More than one cancer patient has said, cancer stopped me, it slowed me down, made me look at God when otherwise I might not have. And we can think of other reasons, by the way, reasons why God is righteous to allow, use suffering, and expect us to be like the Messiah Jesus in the way in which we operate in response to it. And 1 Peter is getting mightily close to that same kind of theme as he insists that suffering is not to be disregarded, but reoriented. And we ought to see it in a new perspective. So the next thing I ought to say is this. This idea of suffering for Christ seems to be a timeless template. This is not just a one-off thing that Peter goes for. It's all throughout the biblical literature. And this brings us close to Paul, who in Romans 8:17 and 18, a chapter that's already been referenced a number of times, said, "And if we are heirs with Christ, then we're joint heirs. If we suffer with Him, and if we suffer with Him, then glory comes next." And he says this in 8:18, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not even worthy to be compared with the glory that shall be revealed in us." You see, something else is ahead, and that helps us move forward as well. We can take a little bit of pain for the moment, right? I think the brother said something like that this morning. If we're looking at the end, we can endure and make it to the end where glorification comes. So enough about this timeless template for all saints. I think that suffering first, then glory is a timeless template for all saints. And this does bring us close. 1 Peter 5:12, you were saying this very thing. This is a purpose statement, isn't it? 1 Peter 5:12, this brings us close to the purpose of 1 Peter. What did he say? This is the grace of God, 5:12, and you ought to stand firm in it. You notice that Peter never tries to get the saints to just divorce themselves from suffering. He asks for them to reorient the way in which they operate in suffering. And so if we think about 1 Peter chapter 1, and here's our text for the afternoon, all of that, I think, sets us up for the therefore of 1:13. Take a look at the text with me. Let's read it together. This is 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13. "Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ." 1:14 says, "As obedient children, do not be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in ignorance. But," verse 15, "like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy.'" All of this sets up the therefore. And this sends us to point number 2. This is our preparation. So we've noticed the situation. Let's take a look at the preparation then that saints ought to make in light of whether it's the crisis confronting the saints in Peter's letter, or if it's us. Either way, it's the same point that he's making. The ultimate point is we ought to prepare for action. Now, there are 3 things that we ought to notice. Number 1, 2a, he calls for prepared and sober minds. If you flip across the page, this is 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 7, where he says, "The end of all things is near. Therefore, be of sound judgment and sober spirit or mind for the purpose of prayer." If you flip one more page over, this is 5:8. He says, "Be of sober spirit, be on the alert." And why? Well, the adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So the first thing he calls for, if we're going to be people of preparedness, is prepared and sober minds. I think there's a lot packed in there, and I heard one brother take this text and use it about the alcohol issue. Maybe there's something to pursue there. If we're to be of sober minds, well, you know where that leads. Point number 2, 2b, we ought to have a hope that is fixed on the grace of the Messiah. Hope isn't one of the major words that's used in the text, but we do read of it a number of times, and again, we're in 1:3 at this point. This is 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3, where he talks about being born again to and as the brother reminded us, this is no dead hope, this is a living hope, and it is by the medium or the vehicle of the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. You almost can't help but read 1 Peter 1:3 without thinking of 3:21, where he says, the like figure whereunto baptism doth also now save us, and you drop out that parenthetical remark. It's not the putting away of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward God. And then he says, oh, and by the way, this is by the resurrection of Jesus Christ. 3:21, doesn't he? Well, there's a connection there, I'm sure. He's saying that if the baptism into which we're to undergo, if we're to undergo baptism that's by the power of the resurrection of Jesus, our hope is through the resurrection of Jesus. It's almost like Peter's saying that everything that we do hinges on the resurrection of Christ. And so the hope that we have should be fixed on him. One more text, this is 3:15. I should probably read with you 3:13 through 16. Let's start in 3:13. This is 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 13. Who is there to harm you if you prove zealous for what is good? But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, suffer as a Christian, 4:12 through 16, you are blessed. And do not fear their intimidation. Do not be troubled. But on the other hand then, sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you. Do you think your Christian hope differs than the world? I would certainly hope so. And so in 3:15, it's in you, yet with gentleness and reverence, and keep a good conscience, so that in the thing in which you are slandered, I would say some of us here have been slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ will be put to shame. And of course, that's set over against the kind of behavior of 4:3 and 4, which we've heard enough about already, is regarded as strange by those who don't live life in the Messiah Jesus. So our hope and the way we approach the world, our worldview, is radically different than anything that our buddies outside of Christ would suggest. And so our hope is different. We need to have prepared and sober minds. We need to have the right hope. And this is number 3. We need to have an anticipation of the Messiah's revelation. This is back to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 13. This grace, your hope, that's in the grace, it's on the grace that Christ brought, is to be brought to you at the revelation, the appearing of Christ Jesus. Now, there is a number of cases where this word occurs in the Greek New Testament, or it's cognates, and all I'm simply going to say at this point is I like what one brother said regarding Acts chapter 17 and verse 30. All of these other national, temporal, representative judgments, if that's even what we've got here in 1 Peter, and I'm not quite sure, they foreshadow a great and final coming day of the Lord. And what did he say about it in Acts 17, 30 and 31? He said, the times of this ignorance got winked at. He commands all men everywhere to repent. Why? He's appointed a day. Not just a day. I know that the text says day. But the day. It's the day by which we'll be judged by the man whom he appointed heir according to the resurrection of the dead. 17:31 of Acts. And the point he's aiming at, Peter is aiming at, the point we ought to be aiming at, is what kind of lifestyle are we leading in view of the coming of Christ? There ought to be an anticipation here, and I like what Paul said regarding the second coming in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 4. But you saints are not like them, that this day would overtake you as a thief. You know, he says in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 2, he says it's as a thief in the night. And then he says to the saints in 5:4, but you're not in that camp. This isn't going to come as a surprise or a shock. You've been anticipating it, haven't you? And that's the kind of thing that I think as saints we ought to be homing in on. It's not just that we ought to have sound minds, the right hope, but it's that we're anticipating what the culmination or the consummation of all of this might look like. And so when we think about preparation and the preparations we ought to make, as Peter's addressees are to prepare, we need to reflect on where we presently stand in relation to God. And then the question, I know I'm speaking to a 5 o'clock Sunday night group, but still, folks, I like what one preacher from the past said, the biggest room in my life is the room for improvement. And I think if you're like me, we can always self-reflect on how to do better. And so as we think about the preparation that we might undertake, we can still make improvements and do better. This sends us to point number 3, and that is transformation. So we've noticed the situation, we've noticed the preparation that we ought to make, and a couple of different points as to how that happens or how that looks. But then our third thing is the transformation that we ought to undergo. Now, if you look at 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 14 with me, he says, as obedient children, do not be conformed. It sounds familiar to some other texts we might be weighing in on at this point, right? Don't be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in your ignorance. And it almost forces us to think about, be ye transformed. It's almost like you can't help but go that next step. If we're not to be conformed, we ought to be transformed from it. And so 1 Peter is getting close to what Paul had to say, but before we say something about that, we ought to at least ponder whether or not this is A, Jewish ignorance, and I think that there's a possibility there, or B, whether this would be Gentile ignorance. Let me say something first about the Jewish ignorance that was present in this day. In Acts chapter 13, Paul shows up at Pisidian Antioch, and he's talking to the boys and girls there. And he says something like this in 13:27. This, as the Jews saw it, and they read the scriptures every Sabbath day, it stopped them in their tracks. It was a stumbling block to them. Other texts in mind at this point. And in 13:27, the final little remark there says something like this. They fulfilled the Old Testament scriptures in condemning him. I find that interesting. In Acts 13, Acts 15, 2 Corinthians 3, we have a couple of different remarks that say they would go into, the Jews, the Hebrews, would go into the synagogue, crack open their Old Testaments, and start reading with the Messiah in view in a number of cases. And somehow when the Messiah showed up, they still missed the boy, missed his identity, didn't have it all pieced out, didn't have it figured out. And in Acts 13:27, he says, this was the hour that fulfilled God's plan. You remember what he said? Luke 22, I'm around 53 at this point. He said to the devil, this is your hour. But it was never really the devil's hour, was it? I mean, he had his moment there. But in John 10, he reminded us that he was not taking Jesus' life. Jesus reminded us that he was laying it down of his own initiative. What's my point? The Jews had should I say repulsive? They had a repulsive view of Jesus. And because they had a repulsive view of Jesus, they missed the Jewish Messiah. The Jewish ignorance here was very prevalent. And I'm not sure that Peter's talking about Jewish ignorance exclusively, but to say that the Jews were ignorant would be an understatement. They were the ones with the text, Romans 3 said, Romans 9 said, and they still missed the Messiah. You'll notice that when Jesus shows up, here's what happens. The brother was around Luke 24 this morning. And Jesus, after the resurrection, shows up and meets the two on the way. One of them, Cleopas, and the other unnamed. And wouldn't you know it, they start to talk to Jesus, not knowing it's him. And Jesus says, beginning in all the scriptures, he speaks of himself. Shouldn't the Messiah suffer these things and then enter into his glory? That's the point. And here's the interesting thing. Jesus moves in, sits down with him, and the text says it was when he, took the bread? And I'm imagining, the text doesn't say this, but I'm reading in a bit. Imagine when he sticks out his hands, and he's got the holes there. The text then says it was upon seeing him take the bread, maybe they saw the holes, and the text says he opened their eyes, their minds, that they might understand the scriptures. It says it once there in 24, about 29 through 31, 33 maybe. And then down again, he does it to the apostles, 44 and 45, as he takes the scriptures and says, it's speaking of me. And in Luke 24, Jesus is unveiling what the Jews had missed. To say that the Jews were ignorant would be an understatement. The second one would be Gentile ignorance. And maybe that's here, but I would just remind us of Acts chapter 17 with Athens, Mars Hill, where Paul walks in, sees the number of gods, and he says, the one you ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you. Now, I'm one of those who thinks that it's neither one or the other. Either case, maybe the ignorance is just a broad, generalized thing. I think that Peter's calling on saints in his own day and even now to turn away from the old age, the world, that Christ, so says Galatians 6, 14 and 15, so says Colossians 2, 14 and 15, had disarmed, crucified, nailed to the tree. And that kind of ignorance, this old age, this old way of thinking, this old way of living, Christ has called us out of. And Peter is insisting, if you look at 1 Peter 1:14 with me, he's called us to be obedient children. Don't be conformed to this world, the former lusts, the ignorance. But with Paul, we might observe, and every preacher says this about Romans 12 because it's right, we ought to be metamorphed, transformed. And that's the point that Peter also is making. He doesn't say the word transformed, but that's the point. We're not to be people of the old age, the old world. We've been called in the Messiah to be a new kind of people, a new creation that has been inaugurated and the consummation still awaits. But he's calling us to live it out now. And that's what 1 Peter is aiming at in 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 14. So thinking about the transformation process, I might call your attention back to 2:21. Look at it one more time with me. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21. He says, we've been called for this purpose. Christ suffered. There's your example. And I'm now reflecting for a moment with you on what our transformation process might look like. It may be difficult. It may look like us undergoing suffering, but this is all part of the transformation process. You see, I had a brother tell me a few weeks ago, he was talking to me about a caterpillar and how it enters into its cocoon. And what comes after the caterpillar? A beautiful butterfly, right? And this boy got the idea, took out his knife and pocket knife. He thought he'd get this bright idea to help this poor caterpillar out. Cut the cocoon open prematurely. And wouldn't you know it that this caterpillar never made the full transformation into a butterfly? You see, people, not just Christians, but people, like one said, are quite an awful lot like tea bags, and you don't know what they're made of until you put them in hot water. And I wonder if sometimes we try to undercut our transformation by dodging and diverting the suffering that would maybe turn us more into the image of Christ. What did Paul say in 2 Corinthians 3:18? But we all, beholding as in a glass or a mirror, you do the lexical work there. It's a darkly, dimly lit thing is what I think he's saying. We can see clearly the face of the Messiah, Jesus. And we're being transformed into the same image as from the Lord, the Spirit. 2 Corinthians 3:18. Give it some thought. But I think our transformation process out of the old world, out of the old age, into a new way of thinking looks an awful lot like that of the Messiah, Jesus. This sends us to point number 4, the sanctification that ought to follow. So here we are as people that are prepared. We're the kind of people that are transforming. And now what's our result? The claim that Peter makes, this is 1:15, we ought to be like the Holy One who called us. We ought to be holy ourselves in all of our behavior. And then he brings in this strand from the Old Testament in a number of places, 1:16. Oh, by the way, he says, here's the reason. It is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And what Peter's saying is that we ought to be committed and conformed to a pattern of holiness. Now let me say something quick about Jesus as who he was. I believe, and you believe this too, that Jesus was God. No dispute with any of you on that. And no dispute, Lord willing, on the next part either. But we believe more than that, don't we? He's not just Jesus being God. He is Jesus as God being a man. Jesus is God being a man. And so when we think about who Jesus is, he is God in human flesh. He is one of us. He's relatable. He's showing us how it looks to do this human thing rightly. And that's what Jesus Christ comes to do. He sets for us a pattern of holiness. Now we need to unpack what that means. But the point I'm making is that the ethical injunction, the stakes are high. He is calling us to an entirely new way of living. This is completely new than what the world offers us. And so when he calls us to holiness, what do we mean? Now regarding holiness, number 1, lexical work takes us only so far. You pick out your favorite lexicon, pick it up, look at the text or look at the lexicon, look at the dictionary, and see what you come up with holiness. I'm saying this, the lexical work only takes us so far. It's not going to give us an adequate piece of what we need. You see what I'm saying? There's more to holiness than just to say set apart, sanctified, something like that. We still then it leaves our minds still a little bothered, and we're like, what does it mean? What does Peter mean when he talks about our holiness? P.T. Forsyth was one of those guys, not a Christian, but P.T. Forsyth was one of those fellows who said that holiness is the term, that if we were to take God and just grab hold of the whole thing and give one term that encompasses everything, we'd slap above the whole thing, holiness. Our God is holy. Well, I like the idea that He's a God of justice. I like that He's a God of mercy. I like that He's a God of love. I like that He's a God of logic, etc., 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 etc. And if we were to give us a term to grab hold of all of it, we'd put right there at the top, our God is holy. Now, that's not too bad, but it still leaves us wondering, so what does it mean when He's calling on us to be holy? Be like God? That's true. So there is a number of points that I could bring out here, but there's one that I want us to home in on, and this is Exodus 15. Look at this. If Peter is drawing on the Old Testament, and he is, this is Exodus chapter 15. You know the story. They've just crossed the sea. Moses has split it wide open, with God's help, of course. They go across. They're singing this song, a song of victory, a new song, as it were, and I'm certain that there's an echo there from the New Testament. But in Exodus 15:11, this question is raised, who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness? And the point that I'm aiming at this point, I'm not going to say all that I need to say about holiness and God's holiness and how we ought to be holy, but I'll make this point. It homes in on God's being different. And I think what Peter's calling on us to realize, at least one of the elements he's bringing to the fore, is that we ought to be a people who is different. There is a problem when the world is indistinguishable from the church and the church is indistinguishable from the world. And when our God is indistinguishable from the gods and the gods are indistinguishable from our God, we've got a problem. And I think Peter's calling on us not only to notice the difference, but to embrace it. And if we're not embracing the difference, well, maybe we're not the pilgrims and the strangers and the exiles that God is with us and that He's calling on us to be. You see in 1 Peter chapter 1, back to our text here, this is 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 17. He calls them people who were, it doesn't say this in my translation, I don't know that it says it in yours either, but the point he's making is that they are exiles. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 17, during the time of your stay on the earth. If you look at chapter 2 and verse 11, he urges them as aliens and strangers, pilgrims, wanderers, not unlike the people of old, who too were wandering around in the desert. But who was with them? And who was leading them? And wasn't it God's purpose to lead them and drag them around out there for 40 years? That's what the Bible says. And why? To transform them? Looks that way. What do you think God's doing with us here on planet Earth? He's transforming us. He's transforming us. Into what or into whom? Into the image of His Son. You see, God is different, and He's a pilgrim or a sojourner with us. The book of Numbers and then the book of Leviticus makes that point ad nauseum. And as He's saying that He is an exile or a pilgrim with us, we too ought to embrace being that kind of different individual wandering around in this world, embracing what it means then, at least one element here, to be holy like God. But as we tie up, how does this happen then? I've got a number of texts here. If you want, you can take the time. All of these texts are going to say, be holy as God is holy. We ought to be holy as God is holy. But as we wrap up then, how does holiness happen? This is 4a, or I've got the numbers there. I guess it's 9a on the worksheet. It's not by transfer. Not by transfer. You see, there's a view out there called penal substitution that says what happens is that Christ pays our debt and that He takes our place, and that God was so wrathful and that He had to have His sense of wrath satisfied, and so it just happens to be that He takes His anger out on the only innocent one who stands in His way, Jesus, and as He goes to be you read who you want to read on this stuff, but some people say that Jesus Christ became sin, which is not a possibility since sin is an action and it doesn't exist apart from sinners. Or some people say that Jesus Christ became a sinner, which won't work either, since the very texts that are allegedly saying this sort of thing say that Jesus Christ never sinned. Hebrews 4:15, 1 Peter chapter 2, and a number of other texts. So it's not by transfer that Jesus Christ takes on our sin in some kind of personal way as He becomes a sinner or He becomes the action of sin. That's just not going to go. It's not by transfer that we're made holy. And I might just say this, it's not a legal thing. It's not a fiscal thing. Whatever the atonement is, it's not by legal means and it's not by fiscal means. And so even when we run across passages like Acts 20:28, purchased it with his own blood. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, you're bought with a price. 1 Corinthians 6, you're bought with a price. 1 Peter 1:18 and 19, you've been bought with the blood. That is a metaphor. This is not God paying off the devil, and it's not paying off himself. It's not paying off anybody. It doesn't happen by transfer. When we become righteous people, it is by, and I'm getting ahead of myself here, it is by identification. I don't like talking about God as the wrathful, vengeful God who we think has this sadistic need to be satisfied. And in fact, in John 8:29, he said, I am with the Father and the Father's with me, and he'll never leave me alone. Why? Because I always do the things that please him. In John 16:32, he told the disciples, you will leave me, but I am not alone. The Father is always with me. John 16 and verse 32. So whatever we make of the English Bible, and I can read it as good as the next guy. Well, maybe not that good, but I can read the English Bible. In Matthew 27:46, whatever it means when he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? We can't walk away with this idea that God's sadistic need had to be satisfied. Something else was going on here. Was God satisfied? Yes. But in what? In seeing this boy from Nazareth, who was about 33 years old, come and selflessly and lovingly and sacrificially lay down his life. And when God looked down, he saw Jesus doing that kind of selfless behavior, and he said, that's humanity done rightly. And then when we read 1 Peter 2:21, he says, and Drew, that's an example for you to be the selfless, suffering sacrifice. No, Jesus doesn't become an adulterer if I've been an adulterer. No, Jesus doesn't become the murderer if I've been a murderer. The transfer of sin and righteousness is unintelligible. Listen to me. The transfer of sin and righteousness, personal sin or personal good deeds, is unintelligible. Something else has to be going on in order for our atonement to be complete. And it's not by that kind of fiscal or wrathful satisfaction that this happens. I could say more, but I'll say a couple of things. When we say that God was satisfied, what satisfied God was the love of Jesus Christ. And I like what N.T. Wright said. In John 3:16, he said, there's a few out there that says, for God so hated the world that he killed the only begotten Son. And I like what Jesus had to say better. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. I think our means of sanctification must be different. Number two, or B, it's not by accident. We don't just stumble upon sanctification. C, it's not by earning. I took all my time on 4A there, and now I'm out of it to say something about how we can't earn salvation. And then D, it's by identification. God has called us into a new style of life to identify in the Messiah Jesus. Now, we've learned at least three things this afternoon, or we should have, or maybe we haven't. But A, we've learned that we've got to plan this stuff out. To be people who are prepared for action, it means that we've got to make a plan. Number two, it means we've got to progress. And C, it means we've got to be practicing people. So where does this whole thing head? What's the end look like? Look at 1 Peter 1. Let's close on this. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. And it's been read 1 trillion times today already, but it's good to read it 1,000,000,001, right? Well, here's 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again to a living hope, through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And 1:4 says, this is to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable, undefiled, it won't fade away. Here it is, reserved in heaven for you. This whole thing ends with us going to glory. That's where it all ends. Mike Burgeon tells the story that he and his father liked to watch baseball. And his father had remembered watching Mickey Mantle, Babe Ruth, some of those older fellas. And he took a liking to it as well, and they were all Yankees fans. Then his son came along. He had a 5-year-old boy named Mikey. And Mikey took a liking to baseball also. But for some reason, Mikey took a liking to the Philadelphia Phillies and loved their mascot. And then all of a sudden one day, the 5-year-old boy, Mikey, got a cancer diagnosis with a very rare and fast-moving form. And Mike, the father, told Mikey that they'd get tickets and go watch a Phillies game before, well, you know where that goes. And so they're sitting at the ballpark, and they've eaten a number of hot dogs, innumerable sodas, and Mikey needs to go to the restroom. And Micah's father grabs and takes him, not unlike I've done today a number of times, and they exit to the restroom. And as Mike is bent over and he's helping the boy Mikey, 5 years old, with his jeans and getting his buckles and everything right, Mikey says, "Dad, I think this is my last game." And Mike tries to explain to him, "No, son, there'll be other games. You just wait and see, there'll be other games." To which he could see this 5-year-old boy looking off into the distance in this bathroom at the ballpark, and he said, "Dad, do you think there'll be baseball in heaven?" And I don't know how you would have answered, but if I had to answer that, I'd have said, "Son, I'm not quite sure. I don't know a whole lot about heaven, but it's out of this world." God bless you.